Have you ever sat quietly at your kitchen table, maybe with a cup of tea cooling in your hands, and asked yourself, where did I go wrong? Not because you feel like a failure, but because the child you once held in your arms, who used to look at you with love and awe, now barely calls, barely listens, and sometimes even talks to you in ways that leave a sting. That kind of pain, the one that comes not from strangers, but from your own flesh and blood, is something no one prepares us for. Especially after all the years you poured your heart and soul into raising them. You might not say it out loud, but deep inside, it hurts. And more than the words they use or the silence they give, what hurts is the feeling of not being seen, not being valued, not being respected. This is not about blame. This is about clarity, peace, and learning how to live with dignity again, starting today. As we get older, we start to see things more clearly. We see how fast the years go by. We see who's there for us and who isn't. And in that quiet space, many mothers begin to carry a silent question. Why doesn't my child respect me the way I hoped they would? So let's talk about that. Let's have the honest, open conversation many people are too afraid to start. Because you deserve respect, not just for what you've done, but for who you are. And if that respect is missing, it's not too late to understand why and how to begin reclaiming it. The truth is, children don't suddenly become distant or dismissive overnight. It often happens little by little, like a house that slowly starts to crack, first in the corners, then through the walls, until one day you realize the foundation has shifted. Respect is like that. It's lost not in big arguments, but in quiet moments when something should have been said but wasn't, when boundaries were needed but love chose silence. Let's take a moment to look back, not with judgment, but with understanding. Maybe there was a time your child spoke harshly and you let it pass. Maybe they forgot your birthday, brushed off your concern, or took your help for granted. You told yourself, they're just stressed, or it's not worth the argument. You let it slide because you loved them. But with every time you stayed silent, something small shifted. Not just in them, but in you. You began to expect less. You started accepting less. And over time, your own heart began to believe that this is just how it is. But it doesn't have to be. One of the greatest lies many mothers have been told is that love must always be selfless. That being a good mother means giving without limits, never asking for anything in return. That your own needs don't matter as long as your child is okay. But that kind of love, while noble, is not sustainable. And more importantly, it doesn't teach your child to respect you. It teaches them to expect you. When love turns into a habit of giving everything and receiving little, it becomes invisible. Like a light that's always on, we only notice it when it's gone. So the first step, if your child no longer treats you with respect, is to understand this simple truth. Respect cannot be demanded, but it must be earned, even by a mother. And the way to earn it is not by giving more. It's by honoring yourself more. Think about it. When was the last time you said no, not out of anger, but out of self-respect? When was the last time you refused a request because it didn't sit right with you? Not to punish them, but to remind yourself, my time matters. My energy matters. I matter. If that sounds difficult, you're not alone. So many mothers have lived their whole lives putting others first, afraid that any sign of resistance might push their children further away. But let me tell you something important. The love that vanishes when you set a boundary was never true love. Real love survives limits. Real love grows when it sees strength. It's okay to say, I'm not available right now. It's okay to say, I don't like the way you're speaking to me. It's okay to say, I need to take care of myself today. These small statements are not confrontations, they are reminders. They remind your child that you are not a background character in their story. You are a person. A mother, yes, but also a woman, a human being. someone who has every right to be treated with kindness, with patience, with respect. Now there's something else that may be even harder to admit, but it must be said. Sometimes when we give too much, we create the very behavior we dread. Think about a fountain that always flows. At first, it's a miracle. Fresh, abundant, beautiful. But if it never stops, people stop noticing. It becomes background noise. A constant. Until one day, they only notice it when it's no longer there. That's what happens when love is poured endlessly without pause. It stops being appreciated, not because it wasn't valuable, but because it was always assumed. You may have given your child everything, your time, your youth, your sacrifices. But if you taught them that love means never saying no, that love means always showing up regardless of how you're treated, then what they learned wasn't love. They learned entitlement. This doesn't make you a bad mother. It makes you a loving one who didn't know there was a better way. And now you do. It's not too late to change. Not to change them, that's not your responsibility. But to change how you show up. To change how you value yourself. To change how you respond, not with bitterness or blame, but with quiet strength. That's where a powerful light shines through. It reminds us that we cannot control others. We can only control ourselves, our choices, our reactions, our mindset. And when you begin to act from that place, not from guilt, not from fear, but from self-respect, something shifts. Your child may not notice right away. They may even push back. But in time, they'll begin to sense something different. A presence that no longer begs. A mother who loves deeply, but now stands firmly. Who listens with an open heart, but no longer allows herself to be walked over. This isn't about punishment. It's about presence. The kind that commands respect, not because you ask for it, but because you live it. So if you've ever asked yourself, why doesn't my child treat me the way I deserve? Start by asking, have I treated myself the way I deserve? Because that's where it begins. And from there, the rest starts to follow. Now take a breath. Sit with that for a moment. Not with sadness, but with strength. Because something powerful begins the moment you decide to stop waiting and start reclaiming. It's one thing to know your worth in your heart, but it's another thing entirely to begin living it, especially when fear tries to hold you back. And if we're being honest, one of the most powerful fears many mothers carry deep inside is the fear of being alone. You might not talk about it openly. You might not even admit it to yourself, but it lingers. It's the reason you sometimes stay silent when you should speak up. It's why you continue saying yes even when your body says no. It's why you tolerate being dismissed or disrespected just to avoid the possibility of being shut out completely. That fear can be overwhelming. What if they stop calling altogether? What if I set boundaries and they disappear from my life completely? What if by asking for respect, I lose the only connection I still have? These are valid questions, and they come from a place of love. But here's another one that's even more important. What are you really holding on to? Is it true connection, or just the illusion of it? Because real connection doesn't require you to shrink yourself. It doesn't require you to tiptoe around someone else's moods, or constantly prove your worth. Real connection brings peace, not exhaustion. Ask yourself this. If your child only reaches out when they need something, if they speak to you with impatience, if they visit but seem miles away emotionally, are you truly being accompanied, or are you simply being used? The loneliest place in the world isn't an empty house. It's being surrounded by people who don't value you. And that kind of loneliness, quiet, invisible, persistent, is what so many mothers carry in silence. But you don't have to carry it anymore. Because the moment you decide that your worth is not tied to who stays or who walks away, is the moment you take your power back. You are not a lesser person if someone decides to leave when you set a healthy boundary. In fact, their leaving simply confirms the truth. They were never truly there to begin with. Now I know how heavy that truth can feel, but don't let it break you. Let it free you. There's a strength that only comes when you stop begging for connection and start building a life that makes you feel alive again, on your own terms. It's the strength of planting new roots, not in other people, but in your own soul. Maybe it starts with something small. A morning walk where you listen to the birds instead of your worries. A phone call to someone who makes you laugh. A class you've always wanted to try. Maybe it's simply sitting with yourself and realizing that your own company can be a beautiful thing. You are not just someone's mother. You are a whole, complex, radiant person with thoughts, dreams, wisdom, and a heart that still beats with purpose. And when you begin to live like that is true, because it is, then something shifts. The fear of loneliness doesn't disappear, but it loses its grip. Because you're no longer afraid of being alone, you're afraid of continuing to live a life where you're unseen. And speaking of being seen, there's another truth that's difficult to face but necessary. A child who doesn't respect their mother is often a child who doesn't respect themselves. Let that sink in. This isn't an excuse for their behavior, but it does offer insight. When someone is hurting, they often hurt others. When someone is lost, they lash out at those closest to them. And sometimes, a child who pushes you away is really struggling with things they can't even name. But that doesn't mean you should carry their pain for them. You've already carried so much. Their childhood, their fears, their futures. But their character? That is their responsibility. One of the most heartbreaking patterns I see is mothers who blame themselves for everything their children do wrong. If a child is cold, she thinks, I must not have shown enough affection. If they're ungrateful, she wonders, did I give too much or too little? If they're distant, she asks, what could I have done differently? These questions don't bring healing. They bring guilt. And guilt, when left unchecked, becomes a prison. There's a powerful truth to remember. We are only responsible for our own actions, not for how others choose to live. You can offer love, but you can't make someone receive it well. You can set the table, but you can't force them to sit with respect. And if they choose not to, you do not need to keep offering yourself up like a sacrifice, hoping that one day they'll change. That's not love. That's martyrdom. Instead, let their behavior teach you something about where they are, not about who you are. Because every time you tolerate disrespect, you are not just allowing it. You are teaching them that it's acceptable, not just to you, but to others. Your silence becomes permission. And slowly, what should have been shocking becomes normal. The harsh tone, the dismissive attitude, the absence. And without even realizing it, you begin to forget what it felt like to be honored, to be spoken to with gentleness, to be looked at with appreciation. You begin to settle for scraps when you once deserved a feast. But it doesn't have to stay that way. You are allowed to say, this is not how I deserve to be treated. You are allowed to withdraw your energy when it's being abused. You are allowed to stop showing up for people who only notice you when they need something. And yes, you are allowed to grieve what's been lost. Because this isn't just about hurt feelings. It's about mourning the image you once had, the hope, the closeness, the dream of a relationship built on mutual love. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel disappointed. But don't live there. Because the moment you stop waiting for someone to finally wake up and see your worth is the moment you begin to truly live again. Maybe your child never gives you the apology you deserve. Maybe they never call the way you wish they would. Maybe they stay distant, cold, and unavailable. But you are still here. And as long as you are here, there is life to be lived, strength to be found, joy to be rediscovered. Not because they changed, but because you did. Letting go of the fantasy doesn't mean you stop loving them. It means you stop waiting to be loved correctly before you allow yourself to thrive. You get to move forward, not with bitterness, but with freedom. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. And now, something even deeper. Gratitude cannot be forced. It must be taught. And sometimes the only way someone learns to be grateful is through absence, through the experience of losing what they took for granted, through silence, not sermons. Many mothers think, if I just keep being patient, kind, and available, they'll eventually realize how much I've done. But sadly, that's not always true, because what's always there becomes invisible. Your presence, your goodness, can only be seen clearly when it's no longer guaranteed. So if you've never said no, if you've never taken a step back, if you've always been the one to reach out, to give, to forgive, to explain, then what reason does your child have to change? We don't learn lessons from comfort. We learn them from contrast. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is allowing someone to feel the absence of what they've abused. That takes courage. It takes strength. And it takes the belief that your peace matters more than their opinion. Because it does. And once you fully believe that, once you begin to act from that truth, your entire life begins to shift. One of the most painful truths you may ever face is this: not all children change. Some don't grow out of their selfishness. Some don't mature into the kind of adults who look back and say, "Thank you, Mom. I see now what you did for me." And waiting for that day, waiting for that moment of recognition can quietly steal years from your life. But what if you stopped waiting? What if you gave yourself permission to live without needing their approval? What if you finally understood that your value doesn't decrease because someone else fails to see it? That's not giving up. That's letting go. And those are two very different things. Letting go means releasing the constant ache, the hope that keeps turning into disappointment. Letting go means taking that energy and using it for yourself, for your healing, your happiness, your well-being. Because you are not just here to exist in the background of someone else's life. You are here to live your own. So take a breath and ask yourself honestly, if you knew your child would never change, never offer the words or warmth you long for, how would you choose to live the rest of your days? Would you still wait by the phone? Would you keep giving until there's nothing left? Or would you finally start doing what lights you up? That's the question that matters most. Because the future isn't promised. And the longer you wait for someone else to validate your worth, the more time you lose to frustration, sadness, and silence. It's been said that the happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. If you spend every day focused on what you're not getting, you're feeding a wound that never heals. But if you focus on what you still have, the sun rising each day, the ability to go for a walk, the power to smile at a stranger or laugh at a memory, then you begin to shift. That shift doesn't mean your pain disappears, but it does mean you're no longer ruled by it. Respect doesn't come from asking for it. It comes from embodying it. And the moment you stop chasing respect from others and start giving it to yourself, something powerful happens. The people around you, your children included, begin to notice. They may not say it. They may not show it right away. But your change changes everything. You stop responding the same way. You stop making yourself smaller. You stop being so easy to reach, so quick to please, so eager to avoid conflict that you forget your own needs. Instead, you become steady, grounded, clear. And in that clarity, you set a boundary, not just with words, but with how you show up. You don't need to yell or punish. You simply need to stop giving more than you have. You need to stop making excuses for their behavior. You need to stop justifying actions that would hurt you if they came from anyone else. And here's something to really think about. Every time you allow disrespect to continue, you're teaching the next generation that this is how mothers should be treated. You're showing your grandchildren that a mother's love is something to be used, not honored. That's not the legacy you want to leave behind. That's not the example you want your life to stand for. So take the harder path, the quieter one, the one that doesn't involve dramatic confrontations or angry outbursts, but firm decisions. The decision to stop waiting. The decision to stop sacrificing your dignity for scraps of affection. The decision to live like someone who knows she matters. That might mean fewer phone calls. It might mean silence for a while. It might mean facing discomfort, not just from them, but from yourself. Because change is uncomfortable, especially when you're used to giving and hoping and bending to keep the peace. But the only peace that lasts is the one that comes from within. When you begin to say no, not because you're angry, but because you're whole, that's when your world begins to open again. Not because others change, but because you do. Say no without apology. Decline without guilt. Let your decisions reflect your worth, not your fear. And when you do that, you teach by example. You teach that love isn't about being endlessly available. It's about presence with purpose. It's about mutual respect. It's about knowing where you end and someone else begins. Even if your child never understands what you're trying to teach, you will know. You will know that you chose peace over pressure, self-worth over self-sacrifice, clarity over confusion. And that choice will change everything. So if you're still wondering, can things get better? The answer is yes. But not because they change. Because you do. And if that change feels scary, that's okay. Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you take the next step anyway. That next step might be small. Maybe today it's just saying to yourself, I deserve better. Maybe it's turning off the phone for an afternoon and doing something you love. Maybe it's talking to a friend, or simply sitting in silence and feeling your own strength. You've spent so many years being strong for others. Now it's time to be strong for yourself. This isn't the end of your story. This is a new chapter. One where you stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself. One where you stop shrinking and start shining. One where you no longer beg for what should be given freely, respect, kindness, love, but instead, you live in a way that commands it without saying a word. So if you're here, listening, feeling these words not just in your mind, but in your heart, then I want you to write one simple sentence in the comments below. A sentence that marks the beginning of your new path. My respect is not negotiable. Say it. Write it. Believe it. Because it's true. You have given enough. You have waited enough. You have hoped enough. Now it's time to live. Fully. Freely. Fiercely. If this message spoke to you, share it with someone who needs it. Another mother who's tired of waiting. Another heart who needs to know that she is not alone. And if you found strength here today, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us. This is a community for people ready to stop waiting and start rising. For those who know the time to live isn't one day, it's now. Here's to you, to your next chapter, to your quiet power, to your unshakable worth. No more begging, no more shrinking. Just you, whole, worthy, and finally respected.